And so I want to talk a little bit about level design. This isn't really specific to 3D, so I'll be using examples from 2D games as well. And uh, it's we're going to be looking at sort of some basic principles. So it's not an exhaustive list of everything that goes into level design, but it's just a few basic principles and guidelines and techniques to get us started. So at this point, we kind of went over the basic tools in Godot for building a scene or building a level, but we really haven't talked about like what to think about when you're building the level, like how to guide people around, what people should be doing, all these different considerations. And obviously, over the years of games being developed, there are certain similarities between different games that people have referenced or used or built upon. And we've gotten to the point where there really is like a lot of writing and scholarship and study of how levels are created. Um, so this is just a kind of like a little bit of an overview of some of the different ideas, but there's lots of different things out there that are good things to look into in terms of learning more about level design. Um, Today, we're just going to look at a few basics to get us started, and I'm hoping at this point you guys have had enough time working with Godot over the past couple weeks that you're familiar with the basic tools, and so you can start thinking more about like the actual progression that a player will take through a level. So you can kind of expand on what we've been doing, which is just kind of placing things in an environment, and start to think more about how that environment fits together, how we're going to traverse that environment. So looking at the posts that we just looked at, obviously some people are starting to build those things out, and so that's good. And what we're going to do now is think about a little bit more about what we're actually doing when we create a level. And so when we start doing some testing, when we start building and adding to it, we'll have a sense of where things are going. So to start out, we're just going to talk about like what a level is, what a level consists of on a technical, uh, you know, uh, on a technical level. So in video games, we typically are going to define a level spatially, um, and so we'll see what that looks like in a second. So it doesn't. It's not always the case, but usually we think of a level as being designed in terms of space, the space that a player can move across, in one stage of the game. Um, so in some games, the level is completely visible. We can see every corner of the space when we begin the level. In some games, we have to discover the level through navigation, through exploring the boundaries of it. So here's an example of a level where we can see the entire space without having to move or change our position, anything. So in Pac-Man, we see the entire level, we see the entire map from a top-down perspective. So we're familiar with the level that Pac-Man consists of. Um, so we can traverse the level, we can move around the level, we can strategize based on what information we have that's given to us at the beginning of the game. And so we can see how this is defined spatially as well. There's different components to the level. We'll break down these sort of different aspects of the level, but we can see pretty clearly many of the sort of principles that we're going to talk about just in this one design right here. Things like the goals of the game. So we have these like parts of the map that are more emphasized, the larger dots that we can collect. We have spaces where we can hide. We can start kind of strategizing based on the space that's presented to. Most games tend to consist of a sequence of levels. Uh, Sometimes levels are based on different spaces within a larger world. Typically, but to move between levels, there's some sort of puzzle or challenge that we have to solve. And then within a game, levels tend to increase in difficulty. The beginning of a level tends to be easier than the end of a level, and the first level tends to be easier than the second level. So This is done in different ways by introducing new challenges or adding to the complexity of the challenges that already exist. But normally we see this kind of like advancing in difficulty through the. So in terms of what a level actually is, it's really just a collection of data. So when we're building a level in Godot, we are connecting these sort of like primitive shapes and colors, materials, and things like that that we have with this idea of space. We're designing the space by moving things around. And the files that we're creating are really just like a list of all the different things that define our level. So that's what a scene looks like in Godot. And if you read through this, some of it might not make that much sense, but some of it, makes a lot of sense, right? Like you can see, this is an example from another game that has a bunch of other types of media in it. So you can see there's references to images, there's references to scripts, there's references to textures and fonts and sound files. And so these are all the resources that the level uses. And then there's just like basically lines of text that say where things are supposed to go, how much space they take up. So things like this we can actually look at in our game template, if we want to look at one of the um, levels that we're working on. So here's level 1. Instead of opening this with Godot, I'm going to open it in Notepad. And so you can see everything that goes into making the level. So I have this like pack scene for a tree. And so that's this resource, and it gives it an ID. And so anytime we see that ID equals 3, we can see stuff related to that tree. So there's a box shape. Here's an instance of the tree. So you can see it's instance of external resource number 3. And here's the transform. So that's the position and size and shape. So that's really all a level is on from a technical perspective. So in theory, we could just write a level in a text editor. We wouldn't even need to necessarily use Godot. But for practical purposes, we want to use visual. We want to be able to design our level visually. So we use Godot or another editor. This is just an example of an old level editor. One of the first sort of like editors that you could use as a um, if you didn't work at a studio. And you can see some examples of map editors. So a lot of times map editors or level editors are created within a game studio for their designers to use. And over the years, some of those map editors or level editors have been made accessible to users or hobbyists, and some game engines and level editors have been created specifically for indie developers or hobbyists to be able to use. So like Godot that we're using right now, like Unity and other tools like that. This is an example of the level editor that was distributed with Z, which is like an old sort of dungeon crawling adventure type game. And it came with a level editor. So that was part of what made the game popular is users could make their own levels and then play them and distribute them among other users. Some games like Doom and Half-Life use shared level editors with other games. So they developed an engine, and then that was used by other games by the same company, or they make them available to other people. So the Stanley Parable is an example of a game that was made on the Half-Life engine. So the developer was able to use all the tools created to make Half-Life, but they made it, obviously, if you've played Stanley Parable, it's a very different style of game. So yeah, that Stanley Parable is a mod, is the technical term. So anyway, that's a little bit of the history. That kind of gets us to today, where we have Godot, we have Unity, Unreal, lots of different game engines with their own versions of level editors and scene editors that we can use to create our own games. So getting into a little bit of principles and design considerations. So, like you know, designing anything, there are rules and sort of guidelines, but you can use your knowledge of those rules to break them or do other things than what's expected. But it's good to kind of understand what the basic concepts are. Um, so with games, guidance is always the first thing that we think about, and it's a very important thing that sometimes gets overlooked. Guidance is very simple. It's just the way that we guide a player through a space or through a game or a challenge or an experience. Guidance is just giving the player either explicit or implicit guides, or sort of like hand holding is another way of talking about it, or cues that help the player understand what they're supposed to be doing. So very, very simple things. Guidance isn't always, sometimes guidance is as simple as like a sign that says go this way. But sometimes guidance, like in this scene from Mario, you can tell this is the first level of Mario, but blocked out without the sprites. And what we see here is that there's no sign that says go to the right, but everything about the scene is telling us that we need to start moving right. So there's simple ways to kind of indicate to the player this is where you're going. If we go back and look at the Pac-Man, it kind of indicates us where we need to go because there's the dots that we want to collect, and then there's the larger dots in the corners that are worth more. So there's these visual ways that we can tell the player what they're supposed to be doing. We also want to make sure the goal of the game is clear. So when even from the very beginning of the game, players should have some sense of what they're supposed to be doing and what the ultimate goal is. So again, you can indicate that through just specific text. Like you can have a narrator say, this is the goal of the game, and this is what you're going to do, or you can do it visually by using visual cues that guide the player's attention. So obstacles and rewards are one of the main ways that we communicate with the to sort of guide them through the level. Obstacles are, challenges or things that make the game difficult. Rewards are things that the player gets for, achieving a challenge, and leads the player towards understanding the mechanics of the game and how to play and how to do it correctly or play well. Uh, in Sonic, we have the rings that's always showing us there's this constant reward feedback that we're getting, that we're playing the game correctly. If we're getting rings, we're constantly getting a visual and an audio cue that you're collecting points and you're advancing in the game in the correct way. And the rings can kind of lead you into different directions. Sometimes you can choose between of achieving things, but it's just a very simple reward that indicates you're achieving the right progress. The perfect player principle is this idea, and again, this is just the guideline. It doesn't you don't have to follow it necessarily, but it's the idea that a player should be able to defeat a game without knowing anything about the game part. The game N, I think, is a good example of this, where it's a very complex platformer game it's very challenging. If you've ever played it, it's really hard to beat the levels, but you can beat the levels. There's perfect information that shows you what you need to do in order to achieve, to get through the level. So you probably won't be able to beat it in the first time you try, but in theory, if you're a perfect player, if you have the perfectly tuned sort of mechanics to play the game, you should be able to beat the level on your first try. So pacing is another consideration. We don't want to have the player just doing the same thing over and over again. That'll quickly become boring. So if we have the player encounter a challenge and then we get a reward, then we're going to have another challenge followed by another reward. We want to have, a back and forth of different types of experiences so that we don't have something that feels like you're just doing the same thing. So if you've ever played the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time, you may, uh, you know, have thoughts about the pacing of that level because it makes you do the same thing over and over again. Or you might like it. There's different opinions about that one. Um, so again, these are just a few different guidelines, not an exhaustive list, and there's some links to some articles and stuff as well below this. But so we'll move on to some techniques. So how do we actually achieve these different guidelines when we're designing a level? So signposting, this is obviously related to guidance. Signposting is just using literal instructions, whether it's a sign in the game world, some sort of dialogue or narrative that tells the player what they're supposed to be doing. This just kind of helps the player understand where to go and what to do. So in this case, we just have like a literal sign that says go. This helps us start navigating. Gating is another very common game mechanic that you'll find where you have to have some object or item like a key to access an area of the level that's not typically accessible. So you see this in a lot of different types of games where there's one area that you want to get to, but in order to get there, there's some obstruction. So you have to figure out how to get through that obstruction. And sometimes that's a literal key, sometimes it's a puzzle, some other type of challenge. Here we see the ice key, very difficult to find key in the Banjo-Kazooie game, which is obviously a literal example of what I'm talking about, but pretty much everything, like most challenges in games are some type of gating, something that prevents you from getting to the next level or getting inside of a room or getting something that you're trying to. Another technique that we use is risk versus reward. This is when we present a player with options for how to achieve, how to get through a level or achieve a particular challenge. And we have to balance the amount of risk versus the amount of reward. Good example of this is the Blood Gulch level from Halo. I don't know if you guys maybe, that was like the big game when I was in college that everybody played all the time. Uh, and so I've seen a lot of it. But in this particular level is very famous because basically to win, you kind of had to just throw yourself into a very vulnerable position and kind of survive long enough. It's a co-op game, so you're playing like a group of players versus another group, and the level is very balanced to where you basically to make any type of attack or sort of progress, you really have to take on a huge amount of risk. So it rewards taking on risk and sort of forces you to take on. But most games do some form of this, and they do it a lot. Like you're constantly balanced, like choosing: is it worth it to get this particular reward, or is it worth it to get this particular power up? Weighing the risks of achieving something, the reward of a particular. Safe zone technique is giving a player a safe area to sort of hide or navigate to understand a level. Pretty basic example of this is Space Invaders. You have these safe zones where you can hide and avoid the aliens and sort of strategize and watch their movement and understand how they're going to approach. And then eventually those safe zones get destroyed over time. So you also have this awareness of the coming challenge. So you have a safe zone to kind of like observe and assess things, but you also have this time, this awareness that kind of foreshadowing is a way of giving the player a sense of what what the future challenges are going to. And this can be narrative, but it can also just be, in terms of game mechanics. You might hear a scary sounding noise or something like that that tells you that there's an enemy approaching, or you might see something like an enemy running away or something like that that tells you that you have a challenge. Uh, this is the first shot of this game called The Outer Wilds, which is one of my favorite recent games. Never played it. Recommend checking it out. It's kind of a space exploration narrative sort of puzzle game, but it has some really, really great narrative components. And this first screenshot is the very opening of the game, and there's all this stuff in there that when you get to the end of the game, you know sort of what they all mean. It's mostly the goals of the game, but at this point, you have no idea what they are. So it's a good example of foreshadowing. Branching is a little bit like risk and reward, but it's more just kind of like the general approach of giving the player different options. Um, I thought it, I guess these are related to each other. So yeah, so branching is giving the player different options, different ways to get through a level or achieve a goal or avoid an obstacle. And then bottlenecking is when you have branches, you bring them back together, you converge on a point or an area so that you can kind of control the overall progress of the game. So this is kind of an example of branching and bottlenecking. And you see this is like a different type. This is from an article about different patterns in choice-based games. And this is kind of talking about like, uh, choose your own adventure games or RPG games where you have lots of different options. There's a few different ways uh, to kind of approach that. And they kind of change the way you have to prepare the assets. So if you have like a heavily branching scene like this, where you start at one place and every new event leads to more events, that means you have to create lots and lots of endings. In this chart, the green endings are good and the red endings are bad. This gauntlet style is when you have like one main narrative and then you have little branches that may just be one bad ending or one good ending or one neutral ending or a loop like this one here. And then this is the one we were just looking at, branching and bottlenecking, where this is probably the most common style, where instead of having like lots and lots of different options or just a few options, you use branching and bottlenecking to create a more dynamic kind of like set or sequence through your level. So you have like a main point, then a bunch of options, and then back to a main point. Then you have two main points, a bunch of options, but then back to another main point. Then you have two main points that have two separate trees with a few different points. You have a few bad endings, but these all resolve to another main point, which goes to the last main point, which has a few good options or a few good endings and a few bad endings. What most games tend to look like if you pick them. Uh, there's a few other things here. Open world map where you can kind of go between all the different points. A loop where you just kind of have go through the same points over and over again. Um, um, so then layering is when we see multiple game mechanics layered on top of each other. If you played Mega Man, the Mega Man games are a really good example of this because they have lots of different mechanics, but they always introduce them to you sort of one at a time, and then they'll layer them together. So you'll start by just learning how to jump and learning how to shoot, and then they'll show you some enemies, and then you have to do both of them at the same time. So that's how they build up the complexity of the game with a few different components. Okay, there's a bunch of different links here if you want to kind of look at these in more detail. There's obviously lots and lots of other information on this as well. There's a couple of websites here that are really useful, like leveldesign.org and World of Level Design. These are just like general websites that have lots and lots of articles and links to articles. So there's like a whole database, articles, interviews, portfolios. So there's like stuff about specific games. There's stuff about different types of games. So there's a lot of different information, a lot of good stuff to look at. And then this is kind of a similar thing with just different tutorials and archives and articles. different things related to level design. Um, there are links here. I'm trying to. This is a really good GDC lecture about level design. This is one, yeah, this is a really good lecture uh, by this game designer Robert Yang, who I think works at NYU. Uh, that's a really good one. He talks a lot about like architecture and history and stuff. Uh, this is a cool article about procedural level design, like dungeon crawlers and stuff. It's really interesting. We probably won't really do that, but it could be an interesting thing to learn about, to reflect on level design in general. Yeah, there's a bunch of other links here. I would take a look at those if you're interested in kind of going deeper on these. Again, this is not an exhaustive uh, overview. This is just like a few different things that are pretty easy to do to get us started. So when you're thinking about, you know, building out your scene in Godot, you can think about these principles. Like uh, sometimes you do it without even thinking about it, like signposting. You might have some really bright light off in the distance that's very appealing. So the player is going to want to move to that. Um, things like gating, you know, you might have a challenge. You might have an area that looks interesting or, you know, more appealing than where you are. And then you might have some obstacle that, you know, prevents you from getting there. Risk and reward and branching are, you know, kind of similar concepts that you might mix together. You might have two different ways of getting to one part of the level, and so the player kind of has to choose which way is better. Uh, so yeah, anyway, there's just a bunch of little things in here. Sometimes you do them naturally, but it's good to kind of understand what they are so you can start to pace out your level and start to think about how you're combining these different techniques, so that you're not just like doing the same thing over and over again. You're kind of creating variety and interest and stuff like that for the player, um, to kind of motivate them to move through your level. All right, I'm going to stop there.